Russia has ratified the deal to establish an alternative to the IMF, the new development bank of the BRICS nations. Other members will need to do the same thing to give the project an official go-ahead. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They make up more than 40% of the world's population, a fifth of global GDP, and almost 17% of global trade. Their bank will be based in Shanghai. It's expected to be functioning by the end of this year. The bank's capacity will be up to $100 billion. It will focus on infrastructure projects. Other countries will be free to join, but the BRICS share will never be less than 55%. Joining me in the now is Jim Rogers, author and financial commentator. Jim, what's wrong with the IMF? The new institution is clearly being set up to challenge Washington-based funds.
Well, first of all, the IMF has never been right about anything. And if you go back and read some of their projections over the past few decades, you think, how do these people stay in business? And the only reason they stay in business is because they have great lobbyists who work for the IMF. They get huge salaries for themselves, great benefits. They don't do anything for the rest of us, but governments haven't figured that out yet. But now, some of the new governments, Russia, China, et cetera, are trying to come up with a competing institution, and I hope they're successful.
What exactly are the BRICS nations unhappy with in the sense of how the IMF works?
Well, first of all, the IMF is set up for the countries that founded it 50 or 60 years ago, and the BRIC nations had no influence then. Nobody was going to give China or India or Brazil any representation at all. They were minor bit players on the world stage. So one of the main complaints is that the people who control the IMF are really not the people who should be controlling the IMF. I mean, why does Italy have more power than India? Why do some of these countries have more power than Russia, for instance, or China, for goodness sake? It's all outdated, outmoded, and it's a bureaucratic, hopeless mess.
But the IMF has been working for decades. It unites 188 states. It has more than $7 billion in reserves. I can barely imagine how BRICS Nations Bank would be able to compete with this.
I think it'd be very easy if the BRICS nations have any brains at all and any competence, or if they only have half a brain, they'll be able to compete. The IMF is corroded. It's been there for decades. None of these people have much knowledge about what's going on in the world. Yes, they have billions of dollars. Yes, they have 188 countries. But it's like anything else that's been around for too long and it's become stultified. It's time for a change. Now, the BRIC nations may be hopeless too, but they got to be smarter than what's there now. And whenever you bring new players into an industry, new kids on the block, they always do better, at least in the beginning.
How will BRICS countries benefit from the creation of this bank? In the short run, it seems like there'll be more spending than profit. What are the long-term goals? Like you said, it always looks easy at the beginning.
The long-term goal is to, first of all, compete with and let these nations, the new nations, have more say in what happens in the international financial community. The countries that are setting this up have essentially no say in the IMF. The IMF is run by the United States almost exclusively. The others have some power. But if the United States says X, then X doesn't happen. So it really will be a chance for these new nations to direct where the investments go, what happens with the money, where the loans go. Now, listen, as far as I'm concerned, none of these things should exist. But if we're going to have the IMF, and the World Bank, I'd rather have competition than no competition.
BRICS will have a majority stake in the project, meaning, of course, that the 5 main nations will be behind all of the decisions of the bank. How will they convince other countries to join the structure, knowing that their interests may be ignored in the future, like we're seeing with this IMF monopoly-style scenario?
Well, the same thing. If a country comes to the IMF or comes to the BRIC Bank, and the BRIC Bank says, we'll give you a loan, and the IMF says we won't, they'll get some business, I assure you. That's what competition is all about. That's why competition is always good for everybody.
All right, Jim Rogers, author and financial commentator with us in the Now from Singapore. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anissa.